Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history drifts softly into the quiet of night. The year is 1943, in the midst of World War II. In India, beneath the pale light of the moon, Bengal's fields stand empty, the harvest is gone, and its people are starving. In villages where laughter once rose with the dawn, silence now settles like ash. Far away, Britain and its allies hold vast grain stores, enough to save millions, and command the ships that could carry it here. Historians say that just 360,000 tons of grain might have averted most of the tragedy. Yet the ships, heavy with wheat, sail past these starving shores, bound for ports thousands of miles away. This is not just the story of food that vanished. It is the story of choices, of an empire deciding whose lives were worth saving and whose would fade quietly, forgotten, in the dust of the fields. So sit close to the fire and let us drift back to Bengal, in the year the earth itself seemed to turn its face away. And before we start, take a second to like and subscribe to the channel so we can make more great stories. Thank you. Now, let's begin. In the first months of 1943, Bengal's fields still bore the scars of the previous year's blows. In October 1942, a violent cyclone slammed into coastal Midnapore, tearing the roofs from homes and ripping rice crops from the earth just weeks before harvest. When the waters withdrew, they left behind a deadly gift: salt in the soil where rice could no longer take root. Weeks later, a fungal blight crept across what remained of the winter crop, turning once healthy grains into black, brittle husks. These disasters slashed yields across the province, but by themselves, they could not explain the scale of the tragedy to come. For generations, Bengal had been the rice bowl of eastern India. Its flat delta lands, braided with rivers, produced harvests that fed both local families and distant markets. Rice here traveled along ancient trade routes that softened the blow of floods, pests, or erratic monsoons. But by the early 1940s, the cushion was gone. Years of poverty after the Great Depression had hollowed out reserves, leaving households dependent on traded rice. One crucial safety net was imports from Burma, a lifeline cut in 1942, when Japanese forces seized it. Overnight, millions of tons of Burmese rice vanished from Indian ports. Poorer rural markets, which had relied most on those imports, were the first to feel the loss. Trade slowed to a trickle. In bazaars and city markets, prices soared, sometimes doubling or tripling, while wages stayed the same. Families already spending nearly all they earned on food could now afford only a fraction of what they needed. The danger was clear even before the cyclone struck. In late 1941, hunger marches stirred in some districts. By 1942, test works designed to measure rural distress found more claimants than they could handle. After the storm and the blight, local administrators sent desperate warnings of failing market systems. Relief committees in towns and villages pleaded for price controls, rationing, and grain shipments from other provinces. Hoarding by traders and wealthier farmers deepened shortages. But it was not the cause, it was the shadow that follows scarcity. In Calcutta's great rice markets, seasoned sellers quietly reduced the grain on display. Where a household once bought a season's worth in a single trip, they now left with one small sack, measuring it out with care. In rural stores, the smallest traders closed altogether when they had nothing left to sell. Villagers who had held back a little from the last harvest were coaxed into selling, only to find the price to buy back had risen beyond their reach. Older residents remembered other lean years, the floods, blights, and lost imports that Bengal had endured before without tipping into famine. In those times, grain moved in from surplus districts, reserves were released, and shipments from other provinces helped fill the gap. But in 1943, each of these measures was delayed, reduced, or stopped entirely. What should have been a regional shortage grew into something far worse. Stand in a market that year, and you'd see empty baskets, bare stalls, and hear the same refrain: shipments delayed or not coming. The reasons went beyond storms or wartime strain. Decisions made far from Bengal about who could move food and where it could go were quietly severing the province's ties to its own supply. Each missed ship and blocked relief measure allowed hunger to seep from the poorest households into villages that had never known such desperation. The natural disasters of 1942, the cyclone, the salt water, the blight, weakened Bengal's food supply. The loss of Burmese rice stripped away its final buffer. But famine came not from nature alone. It came from human choices. Choices that dismantled the systems of transport and trade that once kept Bengal's rice bowl full. And those decisions were not made in the paddies of Midnapore or the markets of Calcutta. They were made in offices directing the war effort, where priorities were set that would leave Bengal without the means to feed its own people. What if the main way you could reach food was cut off almost overnight? Not by storms or bad harvests, but by the very authorities meant to protect you. In 1943, Bengal, the lifelines to food weren't paved roads or railways. They were rivers and creeks, liquid highways threading through a vast delta. For centuries, narrow wooden boats, some with patchwork sails and others light enough to be paddled by hand, carried rice from fertile districts to hungry ones. They ferried goods to bustling market towns and returned heavy with grain from wholesale depots. In this landscape, a boat was as essential as a delivery truck in a modern city. After the Japanese captured Burma in early 1942, British military planners feared Bengal's coast might be next. Those same waterways that kept villages alive, they reasoned, could also ferry an invading force deep inland. Acting on that fear, the colonial government launched what they called a denial policy, a scorched earth measure to keep anything of value out of enemy hands. In parts of coastal Bengal, rice stockpiles were seized or burned. But the most devastating blow came when the authorities took, disabled, or destroyed the boats themselves. The scale was immense. Around 50,000 vessels, anything capable of carrying more than a few hundred kilos, were seized or made useless, leaving barely 7,000 functional boats in a province laced with waterways. Officials didn't stop at the coast. Police and soldiers moved far upriver, stripping traders of the larger craft they had used for years and robbing fishing families of the boats that fed them. Some communities were also uprooted for military construction, leaving families without homes, work, or transport. The change was instant. In some villages, the river one week bustled with boats stacked high with grain. The next, it lay still and silent. Journeys that once took a day became impossible. Surplus grain could no longer reach deficit areas, and market towns found their stalls empty for days at a time. In flood-prone districts, cut off during the monsoon, losing boat transport meant losing all connection to regular food supply. Local relief committees tried to adapt. Small canoes slipped through side channels, with sacks hidden under fishing nets. Traders disguised shipments as market produce. But a vessel that once carried a ton of rice now needed dozens of trips in tiny craft to match its load, an impossible effort as prices rose daily. In some areas, the only rice for sale was in the hands of merchants, wealthy enough to secure inflated stocks or maintain quiet deals with officials. The denial policy didn't just inconvenience trade, it tore apart Bengal's natural safeguards against hunger. In past lean years, grain moved freely from surplus to deficit districts through private networks of merchants and landlords. With transport gone, that lifeline collapsed. Communities that might have weathered months of scarcity now faced hunger within weeks. For the Delta's river islands, the blow was fatal. With no roads, these scattered settlements survived entirely on passing boats. When the seizures came, that link was severed. Reports from some islands told of people living on water plants and roots, not because they lacked money, but because they simply could not reach food, or food could not reach them. Officials in Calcutta defended the policy as a necessary wartime precaution, insisting it could slow an enemy advance. But for the people in the villages, the result was immediate and brutal. Their own government had stripped away both the reserves and the means to reach what little grain remained. This wasn't a slow market failure. It was a sudden, deliberate rupture. Even if food existed elsewhere in Bengal, much of the province could no longer access it. It was as if every major railway line in a modern city had been shut down in the middle of a food crisis. In the months that followed, rivers ran eerily empty, while storehouses in famine-hit districts stayed bare. And still, ships heavy with wheat and rice left Indian ports, not upriver toward the starving villages, but bound for destinations far beyond Bengal's horizon. From the quays of Bombay, Calcutta, and other Indian ports, the tide lifted ships heavy with grain. Labourers bent under sack after sack, trudging up wooden ramps as wheat dust hung in the humid air. But these vessels were not bound for Bengal's empty markets. Their holds, packed tight, were headed thousands of miles away to fill Allied storehouses in Europe and the Middle East, to feed soldiers fighting on far-off fronts. The orders that set these routes did not come from Calcutta or Delhi. They came from the war rooms of Winston Churchill's cabinet in London. In 1943, India remained a colony. The Viceroy managed the day-to-day, but London controlled the lifeline that mattered most, the allocation of shipping space, the difference between famine relief arriving in time or not at all. As early as late 1942, Indian officials were sending exact, urgent requests. They warned of cyclone damage, the collapse of Burmese rice imports, and prices climbing out of reach. One cable pleaded for 600,000 tons of grain to reach India by April 1943, before the next harvest could fail. London's reply offered less than a quarter of that, around 130,000 tons, and told Bengal to send 40,000 tons of its own grain to Ceylon. The gap between need and response was not just large, it was lethal. In London, the official explanation was the shipping crisis. Allied merchant vessels, they argued, were stretched thin carrying troops, arms, and war supplies to the European front. On paper, it sounded unarguable. But records show that Britain still held millions of tons in civilian grain reserves, and that by the summer of 1943, Allied shipping capacity had expanded. There was a window, a chance to send real relief, but the political will was missing. Priority stayed fixed on stockpiling for European campaigns and sustaining other theatres of war. Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, became a messenger of frustration, sending repeated cables detailing collapsing markets, unrest in rural Bengal, and the urgent need for imports from Australia or other British territories. London's replies were slow, partial, and often dismissive. By the time promised shipments arrived, they were too small and too late to blunt the famine's advance. In the War Cabinet, attitudes hardened. Minutes show Churchill blaming the famine on what he called flaws in the Indian population, saying they were breeding like rabbits. This was more than prejudice. It set the tone for a policy in which Bengal's survival ranked low against imperial priorities. Not every British official agreed. Some warned that mass starvation risked sparking unrest dangerous to the war effort itself, pointing to the Quit India movement of 1942 as proof that discontent was already smouldering. Even some military leaders, including Field Marshal Wavell when he later took over as Viceroy, pushed for more resources once they saw the devastation firsthand. But in 1943, these voices could not shift the machinery of imperial supply. Occasionally, under pressure, the War Cabinet approved token shipments. But even when grain reached Calcutta's docks, Bengal's crippled transport system meant much of it never reached the rural districts where hunger was worst. The deliveries created the appearance of action, without the scale to change the outcome. By mid-1943, it was clear to those on the ground that Bengal's hunger was not simply an accident of weather or war, It was shaped by choices made an ocean away. The shipping crisis was less an unavoidable fact than a shield for other priorities. Britain's war machine weighed Bengal's survival against its own needs and found millions of colonial lives expendable. The same policies that sent ships outward with full holds also blocked adequate grain from coming in. They reflected a hierarchy of value: British civilians, allied nations, and armies at the top, starving colonial subjects far below. And in Britain itself, few knew the full truth. Wartime censorship kept famine reports out of public view, making silence yet another barrier between Bengal's starving villages and the help they needed. Not every British official agreed. Some warned that mass starvation risks sparking unrest dangerous to the war effort itself, pointing to the Quit India movement of 1942 as proof that discontent was already smouldering. Even some military leaders, including Field Marshal Wavell when he later took over as Viceroy, pushed for more resources once they saw the devastation firsthand. But in 1943, these voices could not shift the machinery of imperial supply. Occasionally, under pressure, the War Cabinet approved token shipments. But even when grain reached Calcutta's docks, Bengal's crippled transport system meant much of it never reached the rural districts where hunger was worst. The deliveries created the appearance of action, without the scale to change the outcome. By mid-1943, it was clear to those on the ground that Bengal's hunger was not simply an accident of weather or war. It was shaped by choices made an ocean away. The shipping crisis was less an unavoidable fact than a shield for other priorities. Britain's war machine weighed Bengal's survival against its own needs and found millions of colonial lives expendable. The same policies that sent ships outward with full holds also blocked adequate grain from coming in. They reflected a hierarchy of value: British civilians, allied nations, and armies at the top, starving colonial subjects far below. And in Britain itself, few knew the full truth. Wartime censorship kept famine reports out of public view, making silence yet another barrier between Bengal's starving villages and the help they needed. How could millions die while so few beyond Bengal knew the scale of the disaster? In British-ruled India during World War II, part of the answer lay in how the famine was managed on paper, in print, and over the airwaves. It was fought not just in the fields and markets, but in what could and could not be said aloud. Wartime censorship under the Defence of India rules gave colonial authorities sweeping power to block, rewrite, or reframe any reporting they deemed harmful to morale or political stability. These powers went far beyond military matters. In the tense climate of the early 1940s, with the Quit India movement already challenging British rule, a famine was more than a tragedy. It was a political threat. If its full scope reached Britain's public or allied nations, it might shatter the image of imperial competence. From London's perspective, the safer course was to control the narrative, keep reports local, downplay urgency, and sever any link to higher-level policy decisions. For Indian newspapers, this meant printing only what could pass the censor. Severe shortages became supply difficulties. Causes were shifted onto hoarders or provincial missteps, not decisions made in Delhi or London. Editors knew that using words like famine could mean the article never reached the press at all. Foreign correspondents faced delays and restrictions on visiting famine districts. Even if they gathered eyewitness accounts, clearance for overseas transmission could be refused. International outlets might receive only bland notes about localized scarcity, stripped of the human detail that would have conveyed the crisis's scale. The government's own statements reinforced this filtered picture. Relief described as effective, markets as stabilizing, and suffering framed as isolated. Photographs, when permitted, showed orderly queues, ration lines, or calm grain distributions, never the skeletal figures by the roadside or the bodies awaiting burial. It wasn't only about removing facts, it was about showing only the facts that served the official version. Fear of the Defence of India rules encouraged self-censorship. Any piece that might undermine confidence in government risked fines, closure. There were rare breaks in the wall. One came when Ian Stevens, editor of The Statesman in Calcutta, decided that the truth could no longer be kept from public view. At first, his paper followed the restrained line, but as death tolls mounted, Stevens published stark photographs of famine victims on Calcutta's streets, sunken eyes, protruding ribs, children barely able to stand. These images shocked readers, forced a reckoning, and soon reached audiences abroad. By then, the change in perception came too late to save most of those already starving. Censorship had worked hand in hand with wartime shipping priorities to keep the famine from becoming an international emergency. The suppression of information was not an oversight, but a deliberate choice, a calculation that political stability and wartime logistics outweighed the moral imperative to warn the world. For those who lived through it, the gap between official reassurances and daily reality was a wound that lasted long after. They knew that if the truth had been allowed to travel faster and further, help might have come in time. And by the time the gap finally closed, when the images on the printed page matched the streets outside, it was no longer a question of prevention, only of recording what had already been lost. By the summer of 1943, Calcutta's streets wore the marks of a city in the grip of hunger. Pavements once alive with the rattle of carts and the calls of merchants now lay quiet, lined with motionless figures. Some sat slumped against walls, others lay where exhaustion had overtaken them, unmoving under the relentless heat. Flies gathered in clouds. Shopkeepers stepped carefully around bodies each morning to lift their shutters, and by afternoon, the line between the living and the dead could be hard to tell. Many who now endured the streets had come from far-off villages where markets had collapsed months before. They arrived expecting refuge, only to find another, sharper scarcity. Grain prices had tripled in a matter of months, wages had not shifted, and a full day's labor could barely buy enough rice to keep one person alive. Those with means bought in bulk, pushing prices higher still. Shopkeepers, fearing ruin or chasing profit, raised rates far beyond what the poor could pay. Relief kitchens appeared across the city, run by charities, temples, mosques, and neighborhood committees. Some worked tirelessly, but they could not meet the need. Queues formed before sunrise and stretched into hundreds by mid-morning. Supplies were often gone hours before the pots should have emptied. Hospitals fared no better, their beds filled within hours, and the wards could not contain the flood of starvation's victims, let alone the diseases that followed. The toll was visible everywhere. Children crouched alone in alleyways, abandoned when parents collapsed. Others wandered aimlessly, their voices rasping with unanswered pleas. Some asked only for the cloudy water left from boiling rice, hoping it might quiet the ache in their bellies. In October alone, city records noted 3,363 bodies removed from the streets, a number that cannot account for those claimed by family or those who died unseen. Hunger was only the first wave. As strength ebbed, disease surged. Malaria, cholera, and dysentery spread quickly through the cramped quarters where the displaced slept. A body weakened by months without food could not survive what might have been a treatable fever in better times. This second wave cut down many who had endured the first. And yet, life went on in jarring contrast. Trams still clattered down the main roads, shop windows displayed imported goods, and in wealthy neighborhoods, tables were set with abundance. Just streets away, burlap shelters clung to walls, and municipal carts moved slowly, collecting the dead in the pale light of morning. Routes to the docks and rail lines became corridors of emaciation, where daily business passed directly through the heart of the famine. In the countryside, survival had long depended on tightly woven ties, neighbors sharing grain, landlords extending credit, community reserves bridging the months until harvest. But when every household was struck at once, those networks broke. By the time rural families reached Calcutta, they found no such bonds, only strangers as desperate as themselves, and nothing left to give. Some aid did reach the pavement dwellers, but always in amounts too small and too slow. Shipments that arrived were often absorbed by military needs or urban markets before they reached the most desperate. Private charity kept a few alive day by day, but could not halt the city's transformation into a humanitarian disaster. Historians still debate the full toll, perhaps 1.5 million dead, perhaps more than twice that. The wide range speaks to shattered record-keeping and the vast movements of the dying, scattered across cities, roadsides, and unmarked graves. Calcutta's losses, grim as they were only part of the whole. Those who lived through it saw not only the wreckage of human life, but the forces that drove it here. Failed harvests compounded by lost imports, crippled transport, delayed relief, and political decisions made far beyond Bengal. Each face on the pavement was shaped by that chain of choices. Over time, grief gave way to a harder clarity. This was not an unavoidable act of nature, nor merely a misfortune of war. It was a calamity deepened, and in some ways defined, by human hands. That realization, bitter as it was, began to change thought into resolve. And in the months to come, that resolve would take on a power of its own. In the months that followed, the famine began to shift Bengal's political ground. The disaster claimed millions of lives, but it also rewrote how countless others judged the rulers who had presided over it. The slow, inadequate relief efforts became proof for many that, under British rule, Indian needs could be set aside whenever they clashed with imperial priorities. By 1943, the language of self-rule was already familiar, spoken at rallies, printed in pamphlets, carried on banners through the streets. But the famine gave that language a harder edge. What had once been an argument about rights and representation now stood beside the stark reality of mass death. The urgency reached into rural homes that had never joined a march, and into city households that had believed themselves safe from agricultural failures. For many, independence was no longer an abstract cause. It was about whether their families would survive the next crisis. News of starvation travelled quickly into nationalist circles. Leaders drew direct lines from government policy to the diversion of food, and from censorship to the hidden scale of the disaster. The famine was placed alongside a longer story of extraction, wealth, crops, and labour taken for imperial wars. In this telling, Bengal's loss became a symbol of a system that valued empire over the lives it governed. The political climate only deepened the anger. The Quit India movement of 1942 had already seen mass protests crushed and Congress leaders jailed, leaving relief networks crippled when they were needed most. Volunteers who travelled through famine districts returned with survivor accounts, using them not only to stir sympathy, but to fuel indignation, linking human suffering directly to colonial policy. Mass meetings wove famine stories into their appeals, portraying empty granaries, seized boats, and blocked imports as the results of deliberate choices. Anger cut across caste, class, and religion, uniting groups that had rarely acted in common cause. Beyond India, the famine tarnished Britain's wartime image. Leaders in London spoke of fighting for liberty and stability, yet famine in Bengal, occurring alongside continued exports and guarded shipping reserves, sat in sharp contrast. Anti-colonial voices abroad pointed to Bengal as proof that Britain's claims of benevolent rule rang hollow. Within India, the disaster widened the divide between advocates of gradual reform and those convinced that only full independence could safeguard Indian welfare. The question, what would happen if another crisis struck under British rule, no longer needed imagining. The famine itself had given the answer. Many historians argue it accelerated the erosion of faith in imperial governance and lent new momentum to the independence movement. When the war ended, the famine's memory surfaced in speeches, campaigns, and debates. It became a warning invoked by candidates arguing against decisions made in distant capitals. Survivors carried their experiences into discussions of what an independent state must protect above all else. By the time elections were held, the political damage to Britain in Bengal was as deep as the economic and legal grievances of earlier decades. Over time, the famine entered the nation's historical consciousness. Some saw it as the result of deliberate policy, others as catastrophic neglect. But few disputed that official choices had deepened the disaster. Remembering 1943 became a way of stressing the danger of decisions made far from those who bore the consequences. For those who lived through it, the images remained vivid. Bodies in the streets, empty shops, the dull silence of villages stripped of grain. These memories reinforced the belief that control over resources and relief must rest with a government directly answerable to its people. By the time the Union Jack was lowered in 1947, Bengal's famine had left its mark not just on history, but on the political will that had helped bring independence. It stood as both a human tragedy and a turning point, a reminder of how decisions made oceans away could reach deep into Bengal and change the course of a nation. The Bengal famine was not inevitable. It grew from deliberate choices made far from the fields and markets where hunger hit hardest. Wartime priorities decided which ships carried grain, which routes stayed open, and which communities were left cut off. Around 2 to 3 million people died, and historians argue that diverting just a few 100,000 tons of grain, about 360,000, could have prevented much of that loss. It's a reminder that scarcity is often less about what exists and more about who controls it. Did you know so little grain could have made that difference? Tell us what struck you most in the comments, and like and subscribe for more little-known histories about empire and war. In today's crises, who decides whose survival matters most? As you sit with this story, picture the ships still leaving Bengal's shores heavy with grain, while the villages they passed were already starving. Think of the quiet decisions in far-off rooms that rippled across oceans, turning harvests into hunger. History is not only what happened, it's also the paths that might have been taken but never were. Tonight, as the embers fade, may we remember that choices made in distant halls can decide life and death for those who will never know the names of the decision-makers. And may we carry forward the lesson that food, safety and survival should never be bargaining chips in a greater game. Thank you, and until we meet again for another exhausting story, good night.